Hi, and welcome to the brushes for drawing and rendering tutorial using Photoshop. Um, Before I get started in some of the more details or specifics of how to use and create custom brushes in Photoshop, I want to give you a little background information. We'll talk about some of the properties or the settings that we use the brushes, and then we'll actually take a look at a number of brush types and settings and show you how you can modify or customize those for yourself. One of the cool things about using a Cintiq tablet is with a digital pen in your hand that you use as part of that interface, Photoshop's virtual brushes really make digital drawing powerful and flexible. So you can change the tip of the pen from a Prismacolor to a number 2 pencil to a watercolor brush to a wax pencil to charcoal. So even though you're using the same digital pen, you've got the flexibility to imitate a variety of media types. And the fact that Photoshop comes with hundreds of different brushes right out of the box that you can use right away is really helpful. But the most powerful ones and the most effective ones are the ones that I'm going to show you how to create by either modifying those standard brushes or creating new ones of your own. So you can create your own graphic styles and simulate any type of media that you want. So let's start off by talking about brush types before we get into some of the settings. There are basically two brush types in Photoshop, the standard and sampled. And if I pull up the brush preset picker here, the standard are like this hard round, soft round brushes, things that are basically kind of simple, whereas sampled brushes, and we'll get into this later on, might be something like the soft Prismacolor, which has a grain and a texture to it. So it's not just a simple round brush that you can change size and change the hardness of and so forth. Standard brushes can be resized from 1 to 2500 pixels, and they maintain their crispness and resolution. Now you can do the same thing for a sampled brush, but if you sample it at a small size and expand it up to a big size, you'll find that it's going to start becoming pixelated. And we'll talk about that when we get into making custom brushes. One of the things you also notice with all the tools in Photoshop, when I select the brush tool over here on the left, and I'll switch to the selection tool, you can see the option bar changes. When I switch to the brush tool, I've got the options for the brushes. And we'll come back to a bunch of these as we go through. This first is the brush preset picker, which I just showed you. This activates the brushes panel, which will pop up over here or float on the screen, which we'll also take a look at in a while. And then the other settings here are the ones I want to talk about right now. So the first one is blending mode. That's this where it says mode there. Normal means your brush is going to paint an opaque paint on the layer that you're working on. Now there's a lot of settings, and as we go through some of the exercises and tutorials that follow, we'll experiment with those. For the most part, I go between the normal and the multiply. The multiply mode actually allows your brush to, the color to overlay what's underneath. And where there's light colors, the color that you're using shows through. Where there are dark colors, it tends to intensify that dark. So it's kind of the same thing as drawing on a Xerox copy of a site plan, for example, with an art marker over top of it. Where the black lines are, the pigment intensifies those black lines. Where it's light or light gray, the color coats that, and the more white it is, the more pure the color. So again, these also will apply to layers, the style of a layer, which we'll get into in the next tutorial. But for now, we'll just be working with the normal mode until we get into some more advanced stuff. Okay, the first setting that you see, or actually two settings, since we'll talk about them together. The next ones here are opacity and flow. And the opacity seems pretty straightforward, right? That decides or determines whether your paint is 100% opaque or whether it's semi-transparent at whatever you set it. Flow does kind of the same thing. It also affects how much paint is put down when you're using the brush. But the difference between flow and opacity is this. When you have the set, I'll leave the flow at 100% and let's set this down to 20%. So I've just got some black color on there. And when I paint with the opacity at 20%, I can go back and forth over this area a lot, and it never gets darker than 20%. If I set this back to 100 and I set the flow down to 20% and do the same thing, you'll notice that as I go over it, it keeps making it darker and darker, even though I haven't picked the mouse up. And the reason you're seeing a little bit of this ghosting on the screen is because as I'm recording this, it's using a lot of processor power, so its Photoshop isn't running as smoothly as it would normally. You probably won't see that when you try this yourself. So that's the difference. On opacity, as long as you're holding the pen down or the mouse button down, it never puts more than the setting that you have for opacity. With flow, as you go back and forth, it will continue to build that up. So those are kind of helpful options, because sometimes you want to build up by picking a pen up and putting it back down. Sometimes you just want to be able to do it with a single stroke, and that's the difference between these. You also notice up here that I can click to use pen pressure for opacity. So if you're using a tablet like the Cintiqs or Surface Pro 3 or something else, you can turn this on, and then let's see if I come out here and let's make this a little bit smaller. That might help things. Let's put the flow back up to 100%. Then you can see as I push harder, it gets darker. As I go lighter, it gets lighter. And so this way I can also vary that tone. If I go back and forth with added pressure, it makes it darker and darker. So if you want to be able to control that with your hand pressure, just kind of like shading with a pencil, you can do that as well. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the brush preset picker, and that's located up here in the upper left corner of the options bar. And if we click on that, it basically pulls up the, oh, sorry, that's the brush panel. We don't want to look at that yet. Let's take a look at the brush preset picker. That's the first one here. Now, one thing that's important to know is that you can also see another pop-up. This is what's called the tool preset picker, and this means that you can set a particular brush at a particular size with a particular color and some other variables, and this saves all those settings together. So the tool preset picker is actually available for all these other tools as well. You could set up selection tools to have a certain proportion, for example, and it would remember that, so when you pick the tool preset, it automatically sets the options. So a brush, you might be able to set the opacity, the flow. If you just go back and pick the regular brush here, it won't remember that. But if you press the tool, pick the tool preset, it will remember that. So again, we'll come back to that a little bit later. Just make sure you don't click on the first option here. You want the second one. And the first thing I want to mention with this is where you can change the size of and the hardness of the brush on the fly. We've got a list of all the brushes that we can use here. And we've got a little pop-up menu, this kind of standard menu interface that you should get used to. One thing I want you to do right away is set your brush preset picker to large list as preview. Problem is, if you have thumbnails, it doesn't tell you what the name is, and as you start customizing brushes, you can hover over them, but a lot of times the previews look kind of the same, and I don't want to have to hover over every one to figure out what it is. So if you set it to large list, it gives you the preview, but it also gives you the name. And we can resize this if you want it a little bigger, since it's going to fly back into place once we're done with it. The other nice thing is we can get to this anytime while we're painting simply by right-clicking on the screen if the paintbrush is activated. So it will pop it up wherever we right-click, so you don't have to keep going back to the options bar to pull this up. Now, one of the things, if you're looking at your brush preset picker, it probably looks different than mine, other than the way things are displayed, even after you choose large list as the display type. And that's because I have a bunch of custom brushes loaded in, and you can do that. I've provided those for you, and you can do that by going to replace brushes. So click on the little gear with the triangle, left click, go down to replace brushes, and you should have something that actually I think it's a newer one for this year, so let me find it. Okay, it still says 2013. That's these other brush sets are everything that's in here broken down into categories. So I have some basic brushes, diagramming brushes, marker and pencil brushes, symbol brushes, and texture brushes. And we'll take a look at each of those as we go through this tutorial. So select the rendering brushes fall 2013.abr and click load. And this is what you should see. It will simply replace the standard brushes in Photoshop with these. And you can load in any number of brush sets because we have the option to load brushes. That will just keep adding another set to the end. So if you find other custom brushes you like, or somebody else has some that they send you, you can always load those in and append them to the end. Okay, so that's the brush preset picker. We can also use this to, if we right click to rename or delete brushes. I'll show you another way to do that that's a little more flexible than this, but you'll see as we create custom brushes, we'll end up with some extra things that we don't need, and we can go through and delete them that way. Okay, the next thing we're going to take a look at is the brush panel, which is what I kind of popped up before, and that you can get to, again, from the options bar, the little folder icon. You can also pull it up by looking at the window menu and just choose brush, again, opposed to brush presets, or the keyboard shortcut F5. And it's usually, I keep this is one of the panels I always keep parked here, and I can close the panel by clicking on that. I can open it up by clicking on this. And so what this has is really the whole range of settings that we're going to work with. And what I'd like to do as we go through this is to kind of take a look at each of those and see what we can do. So let's just scan through here right now. You can see we have a couple sets. When we click on brush tip shape, it's giving us kind of what we saw in the brush preset picker. There's all our brushes. We have a set of options from shape dynamics, scattering, texture, dual brush, color dynamics, and transfer, which has to do with opacity. Brush pose, and then there's some, these are all settings. If you look at these, we've got a lot of options, which we'll look at. If you click down here, these are simple check boxes. Either it turns them on or it turns them off. So smoothing is always on by default, but again, these are all settings we can vary, and therefore we can take one brush, change these settings, and create a completely different brush to work with. We can use this with any of the tools. So we're looking at it with the paintbrush, but if we click and hold, you see we've got the pencil tool, although we're not going to usually use the pencil tool, and I'll talk about that later as well. But you can use it with the clone stamp tool, the pattern stamp tool, the history brush, anything that can use a brush tip. This brush panel allows us to control what type of brush that we're using with it. So it's very flexible, and once we look at the basic controls and understand what these mean, you'll kind of understand how to experiment with them. There's no set rules for creating a brush in a certain way. It's really just understanding what these parameters mean and how they work. Now, before we start looking at some of them more specifically, what I do want to point out is when I click, let's just click on the shape dynamics, what you'll see here is we've got several options in each of these, and you'll notice that we have a control, usually an option for a control. Sometimes there's just a setting, and then we have something called jitter. So this is what would be called an absolute value. We're setting that to an absolute number. Pen pressure allows us to control that by how much pressure we put on the pen, or there are also variables like down here, we can control it by initial direction or the direction of the pen, and that affects the way the brush works. So those are parameters that are controlled by you because you're using a pressure sensitive pen. If you have a mouse, you'll see this, that it can't be set. I'm not really sure why that's popping up on mine because I do have pen pressure, but it's telling me I don't. Oh, there we go. That cleared it. But if you have a mouse, you'll see that little triangle there telling you, sorry, you can't use this setting because you don't have a pressure sensitive device. The jitter is kind of nice because it just adds randomness in, and you'll see how we can use that. But basically those three things, control values, absolute values, jitter values, those are the three categories that we can adjust. So again, those are important things to remember because there's lots of options, but if you understand how they fit into those categories, it makes it easier to use. Okay, so let's take a look at how we modify some of these, and I think probably the easiest way to do that might be by taking a look at some of the brushes that I already have loaded in and see how they're used. So let's, I'm going to select all this and get it off the screen. And I'm going to come over here and let's see, pick one of these brushes that maybe, just how about a number 2 pencil brush. It's not very big, but it'll show you some of the parameters. So if I click over here on shape dynamics, you'll see that it's controlled by pen pressure. There's no jitter involved. Scattering, it has scattering of the count, which is kind of the density of the particles that are there. And if I draw with this on the screen, you can see, in fact, if I zoom in on that a little bit, you'll start to see the grain a little bit. So it's kind of like pressing lightly right now, just kind of shading like I would with a #2 pencil, and you can see it gives me that nice soft gray appearance. Okay, I'm pressing a little harder right now. And one thing you'll notice, we've got two things going here. Shape dynamics is controlled by pen pressure, and transfer is. So when I press harder, it's light, it's also kind of thin. When I press harder, it gets thicker and darker. If I want to maintain the same line size, but just adjust the opacity, then I can do this. It keeps the line weight exactly the same, but it makes it darker. So again, we have that flexibility just like with a pencil. If you're drawing with a fine tip, well-sharpened pencil, then your lines are going to be pretty consistent until you start getting dull. But if you want to vary that line weight, you can do that actually easier with a Photoshop brush tip than you can with a pencil. The only way to do that really with a pencil is to have kind of a chisel point so you can turn it and get it thicker on one line and thinner on another. So that's what these do. Transfer affects the opacity. Shape dynamics affects how big it is. Now, if we go back to brush tip shape, you can see by default, this is only 2 pixels wide. Now, I can make that bigger or smaller, but again, you might find that you kind of lose the effect because it gets so big, it stretches it out and it really doesn't get that grain. So there's an example of how scaling a sampled brush like that doesn't really work too well. So I'll take it back to 2 pixels. And that gives us the grain. It's designed to work at that scale. So shape dynamics, that's pretty straightforward. Scattering, this is one that, again, this is talking about count. We'll take a look at a brush in a minute that uses scattering and texture. You can see here we've got some grain in there. So part of this grain, which really represents the tooth of the paper, is because as I'm drawing, Photoshop is underlaying that grainy pattern to represent the tooth of the paper, so to speak. Okay, so shape dynamics controls size and it controls angle. Now in this case, the angle really isn't relevant. So when I look at another brush, well, we'll jump over to a symbol brush and show you how that angle is affected. So down here somewhere, I have a ornamental tree brush, and it looks like this. Let me zoom out a little bit. Okay. And I'm going to turn the transfer off so it stays a little darker. Now, if I draw several of these, you can see, and also in this case, I'm going to turn opacity off up here so it's just dark. You can see that each of those tree branches this is the same exact symbol. It's just being rotated. And if I go down to the angle jitter, you can see in the preview, I can move that back and forth, and that's introducing a random amount of rotation in that angle of that brush tip, so that when I paint that on there, I don't get trees that are all exactly the same location, which would make it very obvious that they're copies of one another. By rotating it a little bit, it gives you that randomness and makes it look a little bit more like they were drawn by hand, or they're at least as an attempt to try and keep them, provide some variation in them. So that's kind of what the angle jitter does. That controls that rotation. Now we could do that by other methods, but for something like this, the jitter is really the best way to perform that option. Okay, let's take a look at scattering, and let me go down here and see if I can get another example of this one. I think I have one coarse Prismacolor. So let me again delete this. Okay, so here's scattering. You can see this case, it's not just the count is at 1, but we've got this scatter, and as you can see in the preview below, if I pull that out, it's actually kind of pulling the brush tip apart so that as I draw, we're going to get a little more interesting color here. I'm getting that kind of really grainy, again, because the Prismacolor is kind of waxy. On any type of paper with a tooth, it's going to give a coarser grain than a #2 pencil because it tends to skip across the ridges of the tooth of the paper and not fill in the valleys. Now, of course, if you take a Prismacolor and you keep coloring over it, you can fill it in, and then it gets kind of a waxy buildup on it. And you can do the same thing here. You can keep going over this until it's built up enough that it's really just a solid color if you want to do that. Okay, so that's a good example of scattering. It can scatter in one axis or both axes. So again, experimentation, understanding that that it's just kind of taking the original brush tip and then it's spreading it out to represent that grain. That was something that wasn't in earlier versions of Photoshop, and it really made creating these kind of textured brushes really easy. Okay, the next option I think I looked at a little bit before was texture. If you wanted to create even more texture, you can underlay a pattern, and if you look at that, you can kind of see the pattern reoccurring. It's different than this. This is the graininess, but this has the actual, you can start seeing the pattern of that image there. So basically this is just another Photoshop image that you can create or load in. And if you wanted to represent a coarser type of board, Bristol board or something else like that, you could load that kind of pattern in and everything would pick up that texture as you draw. Dual brush tips is one that you've seen a lot. Almost all the ones I've demonstrated at this point have dual brush tips. And this is, again, a really powerful feature. You go to brush tip shape, and this shows you what the initial brush tip is. And then if you go to dual brush, you can see right there what that is. And, you know, this setting this up is purely a matter of experimentation. It's really hard to predict what changing this brush will do. If I switch down to here, you can see it's just changing the grain. It's kind of creating more of a stippled almost look to it. If I switch to something really different, like a leaf pattern, you can see it's slowing down a bit, but it's, again, changing the grain. It's really just a matter of, you might think, you know, certain brushes would go together, but it really is a matter of experimentation to see if it gives you the grain or the pattern that you want. It's kind of taking one brush and applying another brush to it as you paint. You will notice if you start setting enough of these parameters that even without recording the screen like I'm doing, it can slow Photoshop down a little bit. So you do have to be careful depending on what computer you're on. And sometimes the differences are so subtle, it's really not worth the computing overhead to add that in. And you will actually see, you'll be able to draw faster than the brush can keep up with you. And so you have to either slow down or see if you can create that same effect with a few less parameters, particularly when you're underlying a texture, doing scattering and the dual brush. That creates a lot of overhead there. Color dynamics. This is one that I don't use very often, but it really can be kind of interesting. You can control the foreground background jitter. So let me come over here and change the background to something red. If I turn that on, let's turn this up. You can see that's just green. And I'm not really seeing it that much in there. It's kind of blending that together, I guess, to be able to see it. I'm going to have to really, now you can start seeing it come through. It's very subtle as you adjust it. So it depends on every time you pick up and put down, it's you know, it's a random, it's a jitter, so it's controlling that. I could set that to pen pressure, so I think it'll give me background as I press harder. That's kind of just sticking with the background. Hue jitter, actually it's sampling from around the color wheel when it does that. So you can see here, every time I paint, picked up a little blue, now it's a little more kind of blue-green. And the farther this slides over, the farther around the color wheel it will go to sample. So again, there's times where you might want to actually blend a couple colors to create a mix and still keep the grain. So that can be a useful option. Again, I don't use it that much, but there are times when it comes in handy. And then as I mentioned, transfer is you can affect the flow or the opacity either by control or by jitter. So this is where you would turn on pen pressure if you wanted to affect the opacity by your pen pressure. So there's transparent. And it is important to understand the difference, because when we start doing multiple layers, you could do this, make something look just like this stroke by using a very light green, and it would look like that. But that's not what I'm doing here. This is actually affecting the opacity of it. So it's a semi-transparent green, and that's not the same thing as a light green. So sometimes you want to you want completely opaque pattern, but you want it to be light. That's time where you would turn the transfer off, make sure everything's at 100% in your options bar, and then pick a light green. If you're really trying to blend things with transparency, then you can turn that feature on. But be careful how you use it because it makes a difference down the road. Particularly when we're applying that to layers and we want something on an upper layer to be able to hide something on a lower layer. If it's light, it will still hide it. If it's semi-transparent, then you're gonna be able to see through it. I think the brush pose is actually a new one, and it deals with the tilt of it. Some pens support tilt, some don't. So I'm not going to talk much about that right now, but that's a new one that's been added in Photoshop CC. Noise just kind of adds in random noise to it. Wet edges kind of makes things blur together. This isn't the best brush, but you can see how it's kind of blurring and almost like a watercolor. You get that overlap as though it's a liquid media. Probably wouldn't use it with this type of brush because it represents a dry media. So if you're using watercolor, or there's a brush called drippy water or something like that, you could use this wet edges to get that effect. In fact, there are a couple brushes in the set that I provided that use that setting. Again, it's just a toggle off-on switch. Okay, I'm not going to really deal with texture. I think works at keeping the textures that you're painting over intact instead of blurring them out. But again, that's not one that we probably will use very much. This first set is really the most important one. Shape, scattering, texture, dual brush, and transfer are the ones that you use the most. Color dynamics, you're going to use occasionally. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of the brushes, and I can show you a couple other examples just by, I mentioned the drippy water. It's kind of looks like drippy water, and you can see it's mostly about scattering and a dual brush. This is one where you could, if you were trying to do some shading, you could adjust it to pressure sensitivity, and usually I start it down, and then as I build up over that, it's kind of like building up layers of watercolor, and you can get nice gradation. So sometimes the pen pressure isn't enough to really control that subtlety. So if you set the opacity down and then build that up, and I would usually do this again over a base layer of color that's completely opaque, and that way you get the opaque to hide what's underneath, but you get the nice transparent shading. That's drippy water. I go down, I've got an art marker which kind of picks up grain. If I zoom in, you might be able to see it a little bit better. Well, you might be able to see it better if I turn it up. So yeah, there you go. And this is one that actually you can kind of see the streaks in there. If we look at the anatomy of this, this is one that does have color. So it's doing foreground, background jitters. So you can see I have blue and red, and you can see it's just got little. So if you wanted a lighter blue in there to kind of get more streaks, you could pick up that, shift that up, and then as we do that, it's just getting kind of light streaks through it. A lot more subtle than having the red, or you could use a complementary color if you want. But that's a good example of a brush tip that uses that setting. I've also got brushes like this that kind of create hatching patterns. I've got another one that does this kind of hatch pattern that you might do by hand, but it just paints it on there automatically, and it varies the size with the hand pressure and the opacity with the hand pressure. So again, you can create that kind of variation, and it's a lot faster than picking a number 2 pencil and trying to do that by hand, which is what you would have to do if you were creating that pattern on paper. So again, it's just a way to quickly reproduce that pattern. And if you want to, you could always come in here once that's done, if you think it looks a little too regular, and just add some of your own strokes in there by hand, and that kind of randomizes it a little bit and makes it look like it was completely hand drawn that way. I also have, so that's one of the kind of standard textured brushes that I have in here, and then I also have some other symbol brushes. So the cars one, if I draw this turn this off. This is one that uses shape dynamics and direction control. So if I stroke down, the cars go up and down. If I stroke sideways, if I just drag my cursor around the screen, they follow the car because I have the control set on direction of the stroke. And that gives you a way to kind of use the same thing, but put it in random places. Okay, you also notice brush tip shape. This is one case where I have the spacing. Normally the spacing would be down here, and so when you draw this, you just get a bunch of cars piled up on each other. So in order to avoid that, I stretch the spacing out, and then when I draw it, or even if I do a single stroke, I'm not in danger of getting a second car. The tree symbols are kind of set up the same way. I've spaced it out so that I don't get a repeating pattern that overlaps itself. Okay, so some of these brushes that I just showed you are custom brushes. So how do you do that? How do you set up a custom brush? I'll show you that process and then we'll wrap up this demonstration. Okay, let's get rid of that. So the first thing you do is switch to a regular brush. Okay, and I'm just going to okay, so there's my not very good car, but you get the idea. It's quick and easy. Okay, and let's get rid of this. Okay, so I've created my car. Tree could be a, let's do another one here just beside it. So even if I just wanted this little pattern, talk about kind of training your hand to do little patterns here. Okay, so I've got a pattern there. Now the first one, I'm going to select the car, and you always want to use a rectangle tool to select it. And we'll talk more about selections in another tutorial. But we just make a rectangular selection. It's okay if you have a little space here. And then you go to Edit and define Brush Preset. And we'll just call that Car. And then I can deselect that and go to my brush, open up by right-clicking. And if I go all the way to the bottom, you'll see I have the car there. Now again, it's kind of set so if I draw, it just kind of fills it in, and that's not really what I want. So creating a brush is simple, but it's 2 steps. You draw 3 steps. You draw what you want, you select it, you make a brush. Then you take that brush, change the parameters, and create a second new brush from it, which will then hold the parameters that you set and delete the first one. There's just no way to do just save it with those modifications. You actually have to create a new brush. So if I go to the brush panel, I go to shape dynamics, and I say this is based on direction. I go to my brush tip shape, and we space this out. And I think, to tell you the truth, it probably works better if these are facing horizontal, but I'll see that. I'll find that out in a second. So I got the spacing, I got the brush tip shape. So let me try it. Okay, so what's going on? Well, it's set to pen pressure, so I can make little bitty cards if I want, but I want to turn that off. Okay, so, this is okay. I think I can fix that here too. If I switch that around, if you make it the other direction, you can just go in here and make it 90 degrees, and now it'll follow. Now you can see my spacing isn't quite big enough now that I changed it. There we go. So now if I stroke down, I'm getting cars. If I stroke this way, I can fill up a whole parking lot. And it's actually really hard to get them perfectly horizontal. So in a way, that's kind of good because you have to practice doing quick stroke, but it means each one, if you were putting them on a site plan, for example, they'd all be slightly different. And if you've ever parked in a parking lot, everybody doesn't park straight. So anyway, that's how you set that up. Now let me step this back so I didn't ruin my pattern. There we go. So now I've got those settings set the way I want it to. So I can just click on the brush panel and say new brush preset and say car final, click OK. And now I've got that one down here, and that's the one. If I switch back to this, I get the same thing. But if I go to that one, it's going to give me that car. So what I want to do now is just select this, right click on it, say delete brush. Okay, and I get rid of that kind of preliminary one. Again, like I said, it's kind of that three-step process. Create what you want, select it, make a brush, then modify it, then make a new brush, save it, delete the first one if you don't want it. Okay, so that's kind of the custom brush making process. I can show you the same thing on here. I make my pattern, select it, make a define brush preset. Usually I don't even bother naming it this time. That keeps them straight. So I'll just call that sample brush 8. Deselect it, go to my paintbrush. There's my sample brush. So then I want to go over to this one. I might want shape dynamics controlled by pen pressure. I go to brush tip shape, change the spacing. So they're maybe just barely overlapping. So again, you've created a brush that creates this really complex texture that you can vary back and forth, create a plant texture, ground cover texture. And if you think about how many strokes, pencil strokes would be in that, this is kind of what I refer to as drawing plus, and I'll keep coming back to that as we go through the tutorials. You can draw this by hand with a pencil brush and draw every line if you want, but you can do it a lot faster with this. And you notice that this is controlling pen pressure, and it still has the direction control on it. So I can vary and get kind of a mounding effect with that just by stroking different directions and getting that to orient different ways. Still gives me a nice edge along the top. And then the final step again, new brush preset, call this ground cover texture. And then I want to just go back into my brushes, right click, sample that one, select that one, and delete that brush. And then when you quit Photoshop, it will save this in your default brush presets. It automatically saves that. In another tutorial, I'll show you how to export those brushes and save them actually as brush files like the ones I provided to you to load in. But that's the basics of how to use the brush tools. I suggest going through this more than once if you need to, kind of try opening that document and following along with the settings and just experiment with it. It really is, one, getting to know the types of brushes that you have available and you can start with, and two, seeing how those different parameters and the changes in those parameters can make a difference from one brush to another.